So to finish your quilt, you'll start by laying out all of your blocks in the arrangement of your choice. Begin with the top row. Take the first 2 blocks and place them with right sides together. Use pins to hold the blocks in place. With your sewing machine, use a walking foot and stitch just inside the tack-down stitch. Remove the pins as you go. You will continue to attach the blocks in this fashion for each row. The quilt we are currently constructing will have 4 rows. Once all of your rows are stitched, you will use an iron to press open your seams. We are now ready to attach our rows together. Using the same technique as stitching your blocks together, we will do the same for our rows. Starting at the top, place the top 2 rows with right sides together and pin in place. Using your walking foot, you will stitch just slightly inside your tack-down stitch, attaching your rows together. Continue by attaching as many rows as you have left. Your quilt top is completed at this point. Make sure you have butterflied your seams like we did earlier. At this point, we need to attach our back fabric. You will want to cut your back fabric larger than your quilt top. We do this because as we are attaching the back fabric to the quilt top, the fabric may shift and you do not want to end up with a side that is too short. Our quilt will finish 32 by 32. We made sure to cut our back fabric about 4 inches larger on all sides. 4 inches might be a little much, but just to get the point across, that's how much larger we are cutting ours. You'll be safe if you best practice leaving 2 inches around all sides. Okay, so at this point, let's pin both of the layers together. Now to attach the back fabric to our quilt top, we will use the stitch in the ditch method. This simply means that using a matching or clear thread, we will stitch in between our seams. On this quilt, we will start at the first seam and work our way toward the last. Now, if you're working on a larger quilt, you may find it easier to start in the center and work your way out. Don't forget about both horizontal and vertical seams. At this point, we can trim away any excess back fabric so that it is flush with our quilt top. The last step will be to add the binding to our quilt. We cut our binding 2 inches wide by the length of our quilt plus a few additional inches to accommodate for any hiccups along the way. Our quilt is 128 inches in length, so we cut our strips 2 inches by 140 inches. We will begin by placing our binding just past the first block in the bottom row of our quilt. The bottom edge of the lining is perfectly aligned with the length of the bottom edge of our quilt. Take the corner and fold it down on a 45-degree angle. This fold allows for a clean finish once complete. You will start stitching at the fold, locating 1/2 inch from the bottom edge. Keeping your 1/2 inch seam allowance, keep stitching the length of the quilt until you get to the corner. At the corner, you will need to taper off at a 45-degree angle like you see here. You will now take your binding strip and fold it back toward you. You will then fold it up on itself, allowing the left edge of your binding to align with the left edge of your quilt. Continue to stitch your seam at 1/2 inch around the remaining corners. When you get to your next corner, remember you will have to taper off at that 45-degree angle. Again, you will take your binding strip and fold it back toward you, fold it up, and align that left edge of your binding with the left edge of your quilt. You can always work on the left edge because you will be turning your quilt as you're working in your sewing machine. Continue to stitch your seam around all of the corners at your 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Remember, when you get to each corner, you will have to taper off, fold your binding back, and then fold your binding up. So once we get around the last corner, we are about to meet up where we started our binding. At this point, your excess binding will cover your starting point. Continue to stitch your seam allowance until you have stitched past the fold of your starting point. You can stop here and trim the excess binding. Press your binding so that it is nice and flat from the quilt top side. You will now fold your binding using a double fold around to the back side. Here you will want to make sure that the back of your quilt is facing you. We will begin at the starting point. Since this is the thickest point, we will work on smoothing this out first and then working our way around the rest of the quilt. To begin your double fold, fold your binding in toward the quilt at 1/2 inch. Fold another 1/2 inch and press onto the quilt back. You will need to pin the binding in place all the way around. Last, we will attach the binding. To do this, start in one corner and use a matching or clear thread and stitch in the ditch just next to the fold. Do this all the way around the entirety of the quilt until completely attached. Congratulations, you have finished your quilt.